Well, good morning, everyone. We get to start a new series this morning, and as often happens with a new series, it's with a sense of anticipation. So we've just gone through the Easter season, and last week was magnificent, and hopefully you got to participate in a lot of the activities around that. And what we're going to do now is we're going to go back a little bit, and we're going to look at the experience of Jesus through the life of an individual, and that individual is Peter. Now, I'm a huge fan of Peter, the disciple, and the apostle Peter, because he is kind of this mix, right, of faith and flaws, right? He's this mix of chaos and love and discipline, and I think for me at least, I look at him and I go, wow, sometimes he exhibits the level of courage that I only wish I would exhibit. But then there are other times when he makes mistakes where I'm comforted and say, not even I would have been dumb enough to do that, right? And so Peter is an exciting person for us to look at. And what we're going to do is we're going to follow through over a series of encounters, his experience with Jesus. And actually we're going to end after the Easter season with his experience after Jesus has been resurrected from the dead. And so it's really exciting to have a look at Peter and be encouraged by Peter and who he is and how he can help us understand how to live a real faith with real struggles. And so I just really encourage you over the next 5 weeks to get involved in that and to look at your own life and ask yourself questions around that as we go through it. Now, the story we're going to talk about today, Peter finds himself in a storm. And I was reflecting on this as I was thinking about my own experiences in storms. And in particular, when I was in year 12, I just finished year 12, and my parents and I, all my older siblings didn't come away on our family holiday that year, but my parents and I went to Robe. I used to love going to Robe because it was just a beautiful part of the world, and great beaches there, and there was a really good bakery there, which was really important to me as a teenage male. But one of the things my dad decided we were going to do this time is that we were going to go sailing on a catamaran. Now, if you've ever been sailing on a catamaran before, it's not particularly challenging. You sort of have to know what you're doing, but I don't know if they still do this, but they used to just rent them out to any old clown, and so it's fair enough. They rented this catamaran out to my dad and I remember going down to the lake that we were going to sail this catamaran in and realising, it's pretty windy. And my dad, who was such a classic Australian male, said, no, it'll be fine. It'll be fine. This will be good. Wind is good, right, when you're sailing. So we go onto the sailboat and we just start flying, right? I mean, we are just moving, and I'm getting pretty excited about this. And at the same time thinking, is this entirely safe? Of course, the answer was no, but that's okay. I was a teenage boy, so no idea. And we started to tip the catamaran over. Now, that's not easy to do, right? If you ever sailed in a catamaran, you know that they're not supposed to tip over. That's why they have the two hulls, right? And so and we started to tip this thing over. And the way you fix that is you actually hang off the other side of the catamaran, right? So you're hanging out over the water to try and weigh the thing down, change the center of gravity of the catamaran. Now, you would have thought at that stage, we'd be thinking to ourselves, right, time to go back to port, right? Surely that is the smart thing to do. My dad and I chose another path, right? Which was, we're moving, we're hanging off the side of the catamaran, this is awesome, right? So we just kept going. Now, it got to the point we had to hang so far off the side that we had to stand on the hull of the boat, which was actually, normally that's vertical, and it was so far over that we were actually standing on the hull. And again, it was working, and we were sailing, and we were moving really fast, and we were flying across this lake. The problem was when the deck, the top of the catamaran, started to split from the hull. Right? So our weight on the hull was holding the hull back, but it wasn't holding the deck back, and so it started to split. Now, it might not surprise you to learn that we sunk the catamaran. And it did surprise us, but that's a different issue. So we sunk the catamaran, and I ended up sitting on the catamaran so that they could find it for the next hour and a half, while my dad swam back to shore and went and got someone to come and get me and the catamaran. And anyway, it was actually fun, so I'm okay with that. But it's really interesting how apologetic the catamaran owner was. Oh, I shouldn't have sent you out into that storm. That was really, really dangerous, right? And I thought, yes, you're right. You shouldn't have done that, but it was fun, so I was okay. I didn't say that to him. But what's really interesting is, if I'm honest, this is the way I think God acts, right? I think to myself, God would never send us into a storm. Why would he do that, right? He wants us to be safe. He wants us to have fun. He wants us to have a life free from fear. Except that the more we read the Bible, the more we realize that is not true. And in fact, sometimes God sends us into storms. And if I'm honest, that challenges my authority as God, as a big daddy who just wants to keep me safe and cuddly, right, and warm. Because sometimes he will send us into the storms, but he always has a purpose. So we're going to go to Matthew 14 now, and we're going to talk about a storm that Peter went through. He didn't manage to sink his ship, by the way, so he's already winning over me. But Matthew 14, verse 22 to 23. Immediately after this, Jesus insisted that his disciples get back into the boat and cross to the other side of the lake while he sent the people home. After sending them home, he went up into the hills by himself to pray. Night fell while he was there alone. All right, let's stop there for a second. So, here's what's going on. Jesus' cousin, John the Baptist, has just been killed, right? So just been killed by Herod. Jesus is devastated, and he's looking for a chance to get away by himself alone to pray. And then the crowd, because this is unfortunately the way the crowd was with Jesus, they followed him to the lonely place. And so Jesus was alone with 5,000 of his followers plus women and children, right? So for those of you who are counting, that's not alone, right? And so he gets there, and they're there, and so he just starts healing, because that's Jesus, right? I can see you're broken. I see your needs. I'm going to start healing people. So he starts healing them. And then he points out, hey, they've got nothing to eat. So then he feeds them, right? So 5,000 men plus women and children, so maybe 20,000 people. So Jesus, in the midst of grief, he heals these people, and then he feeds these people, 20,000 of them, and now he's thinking to himself, finally I get a chance to get away, right? Finally I get a chance to get away. But at the same time, and in a different passage, and this is one of the things I love about the Gospels, is that often we will learn different parts of the story from the different Gospels. And so what we learn from John 6, is that the people, they got full bellies, he's healed them, and they're like, let's make this guy king. Now, not unreasonable, right? I mean, he's pretty impressive, right? Let's make him king. And Jesus decides, I got to get away from this, and I've got to get my disciples away from this. So he bundles them into a boat. And then finally, he gets to go up on a mountain or a hill and get away to pray. Now, the boat that he puts the disciples into, he sends them across the Sea of Galilee, and the Sea of Galilee is actually surrounded by hills. So he's standing up on this sitting up on this hill praying, and they are out there. Now, the problem is, a situation is brewing on the lake, right? This is not unusual. Often in the Sea of Galilee, there are significant storms. Excuse me. But here's the situation. Matthew 14:24. Meanwhile, the disciples were in trouble far away from land, for a strong wind had risen, and they were fighting heavy waves. About 3 o'clock in the morning, Jesus came toward them, walking on the water. When the disciples saw him walking on the water, they were terrified. In their fear, they cried out, "It's a ghost." Now, let's just unpack this for a second, okay? So you've got to remember that a chunk of these disciples were fishermen. They were used to the sea, right? They were used to the Sea of Galilee. They made their life, they made their income on the sea, and so they really knew what it was like to be on the ocean. They would have been used to storms. So if they're struggling, it's bad, right? Clearly not as bad as my little robe experience, but bad, right? And they are struggling. And Jesus, what I find fascinating, and we read this in Mark 6, again, another version of the same story, Jesus sitting on his hill looking over the lake. It wasn't that big, the lake. It's about 10 kilometers at its most narrow point. He's looking out and he sees them struggling. And you know what I find fascinating is it takes him until 3 a.m. in the morning to go out and help them. And I reflect on that and I realize, actually, Jesus may have his eyes on us, but he also doesn't always have a problem with us being in the midst of a struggle. He's okay with that, right? And I know sometimes that's hard for us to resonate with that, but again, it's because Jesus is doing something, right? Jesus is doing something here, and I can assure you that if Jesus hasn't come into the midst of your struggle, it's because he's doing something. I can promise you that, because that's who Jesus is. Now, the first century Jews saw the sea as a place of chaos and evil, right? And this might surprise you. Those of you who like to go for a surf or like to go for a swim, this might really surprise you. But that's the way the first century Jews saw the ocean. It was a place of chaos and evil. And in fact, when you go to Revelation, what you learn is, Revelation 21 starts with, there'll be no ocean in heaven. Now, I don't know if it means there's literally no ocean in heaven, but really the point they're trying to make in Revelation is that place of chaos and evil, don't worry about that. You will never experience that sort of experience in heaven, right? So they thought this was quite scary. Now, it might also surprise you that they said, oh, it's a ghost. All right, surely they weren't that so superstitious. Now, to be fair on these guys, certainly the cultures around them believed in ghosts, and that would have leaked into their thinking a bit. But imagine yourself in that boat struggling to row, and you see somebody walk across the water. You've got to rationalize that somehow. A ghost is not a bad theory, right? It's not a bad theory. But then Jesus does what Jesus does, right? Verse 27, but Jesus spoke to them at once. Don't be afraid, he said. Take courage, I am here. Then Peter called to him, Lord, if it's really you, tell me to come to you walking on the water. Yes, come, Jesus said. So Peter went over the side of the boat and walked on the water towards Jesus. I mean, wow. So Jesus comes and he says, take courage, I am here. He literally says, I am, which is interesting because that's the word, that's the name God in the Old Testament gives to himself, right? So Jesus shows up walking on water, says, I am. And they go, okay, we weren't expecting that, right? He's kind of made an announcement about himself that's much bigger than we realize. And what's interesting is their circumstances haven't changed. You'll notice the wind is still there, right? But now Jesus is there. And it's fascinating to me how quickly Peter, bless him, good old Peter, integrates water walking into his thinking about Jesus, right? Now, me, I'm going to have a million questions. Jesus, what are you doing? Get back in the boat. Come on, get in the boat. What are you doing, Jesus? But it's interesting. Peter goes, hang on, there's something going on here. And it might be because he knew about the passage in Job 9:8. He alone has spread out the heavens and marches on the waves of the sea. So what's this passage saying? It's talking about God. And it's saying only God marches on the waves of the sea. Now, Jesus wanted his disciples to be like him. That was the rabbi's way, right? To be like you. And so Peter's like, look, Jesus, if you're walking on the water, maybe I should be walking on the water. Let's do it, I love him for that. The courage that it took, the faith that it took to move. He had a faith to move, to step towards Jesus, because if Jesus was doing it, I want to do it. And I wonder sometimes whether actually what Jesus is doing is what he invites us into, that faith to move, that faith to step into something that is really out there, something that is beyond what we would have imagined or planned for. That faith to move into something new. Now, you would imagine, and if it were me, if I were Jesus, which I think we're all grateful that I'm not, but if I were Jesus, I would say, look, Peter, this is how you do water walking, right? Let me take you through the process, and, it involves faith in me, but there's this other stuff that you need to do. But all Jesus says is, come. And isn't that so like God, right? He says, actually, I want you to do this, come. You just go, but God, I need a plan. I need instructions. I need you to tell me how to do that. But Jesus just says, come. And I was reflecting on this in my own life. A few years ago, I moved companies. And it was actually quite a challenge for me to do that. I was working for a company. I worked for a company for 11 years, and I built up a really strong, positive reputation in that organisation. I was happy. I was getting looked after. There was no reason for me to get out of that boat, I can tell you right now, right? I was really, really good. And then I just got this sense that I was being told to go do this other thing, go move to this other company. And I had to really wrestle with that because I was aware that I was in real danger of losing all that credibility, all that reputation. And so I did it. I moved. And what's really interesting about that is I was partially right. And I hate it when I'm negative and I'm right? Because what I kind of expect is, no, God will bring in that new reputation and people at the new place will go, you're a superstar. We're so glad you're here. And they didn't do that. Now, to be fair, they seem to quite like me now, so that's nice. But God didn't automatically fix my reputation just because I moved. And I was reminded through that whole process, Philippians 2:7, and I don't often quote the New King James, but I really love the way the New King James puts it. It said, Jesus was a person of no reputation. And so I needed to understand a bigger view of who Jesus was so that I could become a person also of no reputation. And I'm just wondering in your lives, are there things right now where you're going to need faith to move? In other words, are there situations right now where you're going to need to step out of that boat and you wish you had real clarity about what that looked like, but you get this prevailing sense that God is saying, come and do that thing. I'm not necessarily going to show you everything, every step, but come. And maybe for some of you that looks like a relationship. Maybe you're being asked to enter into a relationship or maybe even exit from a relationship. Maybe there's somebody that God is saying step closer to, as Ash was talking about this morning with the red frogs. Or maybe there's someone where they are toxic in your life and God is saying step away from that. Maybe it's a new situation in ministry or in study or even in your workplace where God is saying, come. And I guess the question I've got for you this morning is, will you trust Jesus in the midst of the storm to step out of the boat? Because if you're waiting for the detailed instructions, I can almost guarantee you're not going to get them if it's really God. Now, unfortunately, Peter's triumphant faith nearly ends badly. And this is the story of Peter's life. Again, why I'm so sympathetic to Peter. It says in Matthew 14:30, but when he saw the strong wind and the waves, he was terrified and began to sink. Save me, Lord, he shouted. Jesus immediately reached out and grabbed him. You have so little faith, Jesus said. Why did you doubt me? Then they climbed back into the boat and the wind stopped. Now, to his credit, Peter gets out of the boat. There's 11 blokes sitting in that boat that doesn't even occur to them, right? Fair enough. If they are struggling with a storm as seasoned fishermen, Why would you get out of the boat, right? That doesn't make any sense. Peter gets out of the boat, but he's standing there on the waves. I'm assuming they're going up and down, right? Because the wind's blowing. And he's standing there and he's going, oh, wow, I'm standing on the waves. He goes, this feels like a genuine threat, right? Fair enough, right? Fair enough. He would have been able to swim, but quite frankly, when the storms hit, that's no guarantee. And it's really hard to focus on Jesus when things are going wrong. Do you ever notice that? It's really hard to say, Jesus, it's all about you when the waves are going up and down, when the wind's blowing, when your life feels like it's falling apart. It's really hard to go, you know what? I'm just going to focus on Jesus now. Now, I'm not saying we don't do that. I'm just saying it's hard. So I get it. But what I love about Peter, even in the midst of this, even in the midst of starting to sink, what I love about Peter is he knows who to call out to, right? Peter doesn't try to swim. He doesn't try to run back to the boat before he sinks fully. He doesn't just go, oh, well, I'm just going to die now. He says, Jesus, rescue me. Jesus, save me. He knows who to call out to. And the other thing I'll say is that he's close enough to Jesus that Jesus can reach out and grab him. And I think there's a couple of lessons in there for us. First of all, we've got to get in the habit of calling out to God first and not last in the midst of our storms. When it feels like we're sinking, we've got to get in the habit of calling out to God first and not last. And the second thing is, the closer we are to Jesus, the more easy it is for him to reach out and rescue us. And so it's what we do when we're not in the storm that prepares us for being in the storm. Does that make sense? Now, Jesus says something that seems in first thought to be a little harsh. He says, you have so little faith, why did you doubt me? And if I'm Peter, I probably wouldn't have said this, but I'd be thinking it. Hello, Jesus, second man to walk on water. Just saying, right? That's how I would have been in my head. I would have taken the criticism because it was Jesus, but I would have gone, I think that's a little harsh. I'm actually not sure that Jesus was rebuking Peter, though. Jesus was actually using this as a teaching moment. What's fascinating here is the winds haven't died down, the waves are still going, and Jesus is like, right, Peter, this is a teaching moment. I'm thinking, Lord, surely this is not the right time. Surely in the midst of the storm is not the right time. And I would say the same to us. If we think that God is going to pause the storm to introduce us to teaching moments, my experience is we're sadly mistaken. And what he says is, you have little faith. Now, Peter's walked on water. It's not about the size of his faith, because clearly walking on water shows an abundance of faith. It's that the faith didn't last. Does that make sense? So it's more about the fact that he started walking on water. And one would imagine every step you take walking on the water would increase your faith, right? It would increase it. But in fact, he goes the opposite way. And how true is that of us? Even while God is in the midst of our storm doing things, ironically, our faith starts to decrease. That can often happen, right? We start looking at the waves and we start looking at the wind and we go, wow, this is too much. And so Jesus is saying, actually, Peter, it's not that you didn't have faith, it's just that your faith didn't last. And that's important, Peter. You need to understand that the storms aren't going to go away and your faith needs to last. And then the second thing he talks about is this idea of doubt. Why did you doubt me? That's a really interesting question. The word there, doubt, literally means split in two. And the idea is that you're kind of standing on two foundations at the same time. You're standing on the circumstances and you're standing on Jesus, and you're trying to get balance out of the two of those. And basically what Jesus is saying is that cannot happen. You can't stand on two foundations. You can only stand on one. And perhaps to illustrate this, I'll explain to you my short-lived skiing career. So a couple of years ago, Noel and I and the family went to New Zealand to pick up Samuel, because he'd been in New Zealand for a semester studying. And then we had a holiday and we went skiing. Now, I was convinced I was going to be an awesome skier. I have no basis for that conviction, but nonetheless, I was convinced I was going to be really good at it. And I had damaged my knee back when I was a teenager. I did a lot of stupid things when I was a teenager, and it had a knee reconstruction. And if you know anything about skiing, right, fundamentally, you probably know a lot more than me if you know anything about skiing, but fundamentally, you have to control of both skis. Makes sense, right? And one of the first things they teach you is the wedge, right? And that's the idea that you turn both your feet in, and that helps you stop. Stopping is really important in skiing, right? Seems self-evident. I wasn't aware of it, but nonetheless. And so it teaches you to stop. And my problem was, my left knee is the bad one. I could never turn the left knee around enough to make a wedge. Like I couldn't control it enough to make the wedge. And so my stop more looked like sliding into things, right? And that's fundamentally the way I stopped. And at the point that I took out the skiing instructor, who was quite a small, petite lady, that's when we realized my skiing career was over, right? But that is fundamentally the illustration of what it looks like to be in doubt, right? To stand on two foundations at once and have the one that's a bad foundation control the one that's a good foundation. And Jesus is saying to Peter, you've got to choose. You've got to choose which foundation you're going to stand on. And I reflect on this on my own life. And there's this invitation from Jesus, a faith to remain, if that makes sense, a faith to remain in the midst of the storm. And I was reflecting on that very much in my own life. And I was reflecting on, many of you may know that Noelle, about 18 months ago or so, got diagnosed with breast cancer. And look, I won't undervalue in any way, shape or form the amount of fear and challenge that presented to Noelle, but what I can tell you is, as someone who loves Noelle more than just about anyone I know, I can tell you that was a devastating time for me, right? And it was really, really challenging to watch her go through the challenge of that. And you know, even just recently, we've had another day surgery, and the good news is to check in on it. And the good news is the day surgery brought things out. It's all good, right? She's doing okay, but that's a storm that's not going to go away, right? We've got years of this ahead of us, of checking and making sure she's okay. And I got to tell you, it's hard. I found it hard to look to Jesus through that process. I found it really hard. But then I was reminded of Jairus' story when, if you don't know the story, Jairus goes and he reaches out to Jesus to come and heal his daughter. And what I love is the level of compassion Jesus shows to Jairus. He's going to heal the daughter, that's great, but he shows an incredible amount of compassion to Jairus. And I'm reminded of the fact that Jesus, no matter where we are in the situation, he wants to care for us. He wants to deal with our fears, and he wants to show us who he is in the midst of that. And I'm just wondering whether any of you are in a similar situation at the moment. Maybe it's a health-related thing. Maybe you can resonate either, maybe you're on my side, i.e. watching a loved one go through significant health challenges, or yourself going through health challenges, and saying, God, where are you? Where are you in the midst of it? My belief is that Jesus wants to show you where he is in the midst of it. Maybe for you, your lifestyle is just so hectic. We use this word busy a lot, right? And our life just seems so full, and we go, when is it ever going to stop? And I got to tell you, the way our society runs at the moment, I'm not sure it is for any of us. I'm sure busy is going to be our reality. And so we've got to learn to find Jesus in the midst of that busyness, because he wants to give us a faith to remain. Now, it's interesting that Jesus allowed them to go through all this. Why did Jesus allow them to go through this storm? And I don't think we have a full answer, but I will read this. Matthew 14:33. Then the disciples worshipped him. You really are the Son of God, they exclaimed. And what's happened here is they've moved. You might remember they thought Jesus was a teacher and a prophet before this. This is actually the first time in the book of Matthew that they acknowledge Jesus as something more than just a teacher or prophet. They acknowledge him as God. Now, we've already talked about the fact that God is the only one that walks on water. What Jesus has also done is he's stopped the wind. You might go, well, he fed 5,000, so maybe that's just part of the miracle toolkit, right? Here's another miracle to bring up. Look at me stopping the wind. But they would have known Psalm 107:29, which said, he calmed the storm to a whisper and stilled the waves. The only one who has control over the weather is in fact God. And it's like the lights finally went on and they worshipped him for who he truly was. They understood that he was much bigger than they ever believed. They had no idea he was much bigger than they understood at that moment. And what I want to leave us with this morning is this idea that Jesus is much bigger than you think. He's much bigger than you've ever experienced. And even as he invites you and sometimes sends you into the storms of life, he wants to show you who he is. He wants you to see his bigness. He wants you to understand that you can in fact have faith to move and faith to remain because of who he is. Not because of who you are, not because of your circumstances, but because who he is. I want to invite you to stand, if you will, please. And I want to pray for some people. Because there's no way you can G yourself up to more faith, right? Faith is a gift. It's a gift from God. And there are many of you this morning who are in the midst of storms and you're really struggling. And if you're not right now, I can almost guarantee you will be or have been. So I just invite you, if you will, to close your eyes. Don't do that for any other reason but that you can just be you and God. And if you right now are finding yourself in a storm and you know you've got to have faith to step out now. You've got to have a faith to step out without all the instructions. I just invite you to put your hands out in front of you and say, okay, I don't know what it looks like. I don't know what it looks like to step out, but God, I'm going to do it. I'm going to step out. You say come, I'm going to come. If that's you, I just invite you to put your hands out just as a way of acknowledging to God. No one's going to call you out on it, but it's just an invitation between you and God to say, I know I need that. There's a second group of people that I also want to pray for, so keep your hands out. And that is, you're in the midst of a storm right now, and boy, you're done. You're so exhausted and so over this storm, and you're done, and you don't think, maybe you're hanging on by your fingernails, and you don't think you have faith to remain. And if that's you, I want to invite you to also stick your hands out, if that's you, that you are someone who desperately needs faith to remain right now in what you're currently going through, in the current storm you're going through. And I just want to pray for you now. Oh, Jesus, we know it's easy to talk about storms when we're not in one, but it's so much harder to talk about them when we are. And for these people that have held out their hands today and said, I'm in a storm, I know that you see them. They may not see you, but you see them right now. And I know They may have an idea about when you should show up. And that idea might be a little different than what you're planning, God. But I pray right now for faith to move, to faith to remain, knowing full well that you are there. You are the great I am. And in the midst of people's storms, that you want to show them a bigger view of yourself. Jesus, I know there's always more to show of who you are to each one of us. And I pray for each one of these people and all of us really, that we would this morning, this week, this month, this year, get a greater view of who you are, to experience you in a way that we've never dreamed of before, that changes us, like it changed Peter, like it changed the disciples. Not for our glory or for our comfort, but for your glory. I pray for those who just need healing this morning, God, especially. Would you come? Would you come and bring healing? Not because any one of us deserves it, but because you're a good God. Would you come? And I pray this in Jesus' great name.